Howdy folks, it's me, Josh. For over 2.5 millennia, Persia has consistently remained one of the most prominent empires in the world, having a long and rich monarchical history dating all the way back to Cyrus the Great. But it was only in the 1970s when, after just a few bad years, the millennia-old Persian monarchy came crashing down. How did that happen? And what if the Persian monarchy survived? As I was saying, Persia, alongside many other ancient empires, most notably China, had gone through a dynastic cycle in which one dynasty would come to power before a revolt broke out, or more commonly, Persia was invaded, and a new dynasty took its place. This went on for about 2,300 years when, in the late 18th century, Persia found itself under the rule of the Qajar dynasty, who would rule over Persia throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. However, this was not the best time to be a ruling dynasty in Persia. In the early 20th century, Qajar Persia found itself under heavy foreign influence, particularly from Britain and Russia. Due to this, as well as the Qajar's increasingly authoritarian rule, many in Persia would begin to push back against the government, calling for greater independence and constitutionalization of the government. A revolt would end up breaking out, whose aftermath ultimately left a power vacuum in the Persian government, with one General Reza Khan taking advantage of the situation. Reza overthrew the last Qajar Shah before proclaiming himself as Reza Shah of the new Pahlavi dynasty. He then went on to heavily secularize Persia, outright banning many Islamic religious practices, which would greatly anger Persia's Shia clergy. Remember this, it's gonna be important later. Despite the new regime, Persia was still under heavy British influence. When World War II broke out, Persia stayed neutral, but that wasn't good enough for Britain. So, when Germany invaded Russia, Britain demanded that Reza expel all Germans in Persia. Reza said no, and so Britain, seeing that Reza was clearly a Nazi sympathizer who needed to be ousted, and in order to support their supply lines in Russia, Britain invaded Persia, ousting Reza Shah, replacing him with his 21-year-old son, Muhammad Reza Shah. Ever since the beginning of the century, Britain held a monopoly over the oil industry in Persia through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which quickly became a target for Persians seeking to root out foreign influence, ultimately leading to the rise to prominence of a nationalist politician named Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh and the Shah found themselves in a power struggle throughout much of the late 1940s, until, in 1951, Mossadegh was named Prime Minister before immediately nationalizing the Persian oil industry. Britain, understandably pissed that Persia had just taken one of, if not their most important source of oil, demanded punishment, placing an embargo on Persia. The US, which had just emerged as one of the two dominant world superpowers, was initially supportive of Mossadegh, seeing Britain as an imperialist power trying to exert their influence on a sovereign nation. But with the election of Dwight Eisenhower in 1952, the US policy towards Persia changed dramatically. Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Dulles, was worried that, if nothing was done, Persia might fall under communism and Soviet influence just like China had a few years prior. So, in 1953, the CIA staged a coup, ousting Mossadegh, once again creating a power vacuum. After the coup, the elite in Persia saw an opportunity to take back control over the country, relegating the Shah to being a mere figurehead of their regime. But, fearing that he might meet the same fate as the last Qajar Shah, the Shah came up with a plan. Not long after the coup, the elites in Persia quickly broke down into factions, each trying to take power for themselves. So, the Shah managed to play off their disputes, pitting them against each other before taking power for himself, with Persia coming under his absolute control. The Shah was a firm ally of the West and loved all things modern, but also had a deep respect for Persian history, especially for his idol, Cyrus the Great, whose rule he wished to emulate. And knowing he couldn't rely on the hostile elites, and also fearing a communist revolution, he decided to attempt to kill 3 birds with one stone with his White Revolution. The White Revolution was a series of reforms which was meant to A. Modernize and westernize Persia through a series of social and economic reforms, B, build a support base for the Shah among the peasantry so he wouldn't have to rely on the elites, as well as present himself as a populist leader, and C, prevent the outbreak of a communist revolution. His plan was perfect. Except for the fact that it was terrible because the way that it was executed ended up creating nearly all of the problems he was trying to avoid. Let's start with the first part, modernizing and westernizing Persia. To an extent, this part was actually decently successful. For a while, Persia ended up seeing an economic boom under the Shah's reign, and he introduced many Western social and political practices, such as giving women the right to vote, and also greatly improving education and literacy. However, the Shia clergy wasn't too happy about what they saw as a dismantling of the Islamic social and political structures within Iran, fueling anger among Islamists. Next, let's look at the second part, building a support base among the peasantry. This one went really badly. The main way the Shah tried to do this was through land reform, buying a bunch of land from wealthy landlords and attempting to sell it to the peasantry. But the peasantry would never get that land, as all this resulted in was the creation of a class of commercial farmers with no loyalty to the Shah, as many of the now landless peasants moved into the cities for jobs where their discontent towards the Shah continued to grow. As for the last part, preventing a communist revolution, this part also succeeded. But instead of a communist revolution, the Shah's actions would only pave the way for a completely different one. And so, as a result, Persia would end up being extremely unified under one common idea. The idea that the Shah absolutely sucked. The elites were pissed at the Shah for breaking ties with them, the peasants were pissed that they never got their promised land, the clergy was pissed about the dismantling of Islamic practices within Persia, the liberals were pissed about his authoritarian governance, and the communists were pissed because, well, of course they were. The only people that were actually still supportive of the Shah was the United States, but this would only lead the Persian populace to see him as an American puppet. All of this opposition to the Shah's regime would ultimately lead to the rise to prominence of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a Shia cleric who was staunchly opposed to the Shah's westernization efforts, seeing it as a threat to Islam in Iran. Khomeini advocated for clerical government and populism, denouncing the Shah's regime, which would ultimately lead him to get exiled in 1964. But even so, he continued pushing his ideas in Iran, bolstering his own support and uniting the opposition to the Shah around him. Except for the communists. By the 1970s, a long string of circumstances would ultimately lead to the Shah's downfall. In 1971, the Shah held a huge celebration for the 2500-year anniversary of the establishment of the Persian Empire by Cyrus the Great. The party was super extravagant and expensive, and even worse, there was alcohol. And even more than that, afterwards, he changed the beginning of the Persian calendar from the beginning of the Islamic calendar to the year when Cyrus ascended to the throne. This whole debacle went to show many in Iran that the Shah didn't care about Islamic tradition, bolstering their opposition. Then, in 1973, after the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War, many oil-exporting states in Arabia placed embargoes on the West, which led the prices of oil to skyrocket. Many in Persia were hoping that this would lead to an economic boom, with Western powers lining up for Persian oil. But instead, all the wealth that came in went to the upper classes, leaving the lower classes with nothing except a bunch of inflation, further bolstering opposition to the Shah. In 1975, in order to combat the inflation, the Shah decided to set up his own new political party, banning all others, making Persia a one-party state, before putting in place a bunch of taxes, which only pissed off a bunch of merchants as well. The US, now under Jimmy Carter, wasn't very happy about the Shah setting up a one-party state, so they sent a polite reminder that the Shah needed to respect his citizens' political freedom. However, a few years prior, in 1974, the Shah was diagnosed with cancer. And a few years down the line, as his symptoms worsened, the once vigorous and masculine emperor found himself depressed and unable to carry out his duties effectively. So by 1977, due to this, as well as in an attempt to ease the unrest in the country, the Shah began to put in place measures to liberalize the country, promising a return to open elections and political freedom. However, it was too little too late, as later that year, the mysterious death of Khomeini's son would ultimately result in a chain of events leading to the Iranian Revolution, overthrowing the monarchy, with the Shah fleeing to Egypt. In the aftermath of the revolution, Khomeini returned to Iran, where he then became the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. One aspect of the Shah's rule that I didn't mention, though, was his expert ability to maintain peace throughout the Middle East. And so, with him gone, the Middle East exploded. When he went to the US to receive treatment, Iran reacted by kidnapping a bunch of Americans, resulting in the Iranian hostage crisis. And, not long after, Saddam Hussein of Iraq, pissed that Khomeini had advocated for the overthrow of his regime, and wanting to annex the largely Arab region of Khuzestan, decided that, due to the chaos in Iran, that this would be the perfect time to invade, resulting in the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War. Even past that, the success of the revolution in Iran inspired many Islamists in the Middle East, as well as around the world, to become invigorated, resulting in an Islamic revival worldwide, leading to the spread of fundamentalist Islam, resulting in the Soviet-Afghan War and the creation of terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda. In 1980, though, after battling with cancer for years, the Shah would then pass away, with his son, the would-be Reza Shah, proclaiming himself as the rightful king of Persia. And despite him not even living in Iran, he's remained active in his opposition to Khomeini's government even up to the present day, pushing for greater democratization and westernization. But despite this, Iran has remained under the rule of Khomeini's theocratic government up to this day. But what if that changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the White Revolution had gone as planned and the Shah managed to build a support base in Persia and successfully keep the Khomeinists from reaching the level of support they saw in our timeline? With the Shah managing to build the support base he needed, he would manage to avoid the Iranian Revolution, keeping his regime in power, ruling until his death in 1980. Without the Iranian Revolution, this changes a lot. For instance, the Iran-Iraq War never happens, so the Gulf War never happens either, and neither does the 2003 Iraq War. Actually, without the rise of Islamic fundamentalism that came after the Iranian Revolution, the War on Terror never happens as a whole, nor does dehydration. This means a lot of things for America. Without things such as the Gulf War and dehydration fueling the neoconservative push for increased foreign interventionism, the US likely doesn't end up following the George Bush path of neoconservatism and interventionism, instead likely following the Pat Buchanan path of paleoconservatism and non-interventionism. As a result, the US ends up focusing much more on internal politics, generally leaving the rest of the world to its own devices, instead of acting as the world police like they did in our timeline. And with a likely Pat Buchanan presidency somewhere down the line, and without 9/11, the US doesn't see the establishment of the national security state that it did in our timeline, and likely not seeing nearly as much liberalization without an Obama presidency, with the world as a whole not seeing nearly as much widespread liberalism as it did in our timeline. So, America would end up going back to its traditional position of isolationism, putting the American people before that of foreign involvement. For Persia, this means a lot of things. After the Shah's death in 1980, he would be succeeded by his son, Reza Shah, who would further liberalize and democratize Persia, but without the US putting pressure on him to do so, he would likely still retain a strong hold over the government and retain a level of authoritarianism. It's worth noting that, before the Iranian Revolution, due to its economic and military growth, it was widely held that Persia was on track to not only dominate the Middle East, but also to emerge as a world power on its own. So, as Saudi Arabia doesn't emerge as nearly as influential in the Middle East as it did in our timeline, and the Persian economy continues to boom, Persia would manage to achieve essential hegemony over the Middle East, becoming the dominant economic and military power in the region. They might then seek to create some sort of economic union across the Middle East in order to secure its domination and, in a way, recreate its old empire. And following the end of the Cold War, Persia would begin seeking to spread its influence into the Caucasus and Central Asia and chart its path to becoming a world power once again. Meanwhile, as the US doesn't seek the same interventionist policy as it did in our timeline, NATO likely doesn't expand into Eastern Europe, with much of it coming under Russian influence, with conflicts such as the Ukraine war never happening. But as Persia expands its sphere of influence towards Russia, this would likely lead to a rivalry emerging between Russia and Persia over regions in the Caucasus and Central Asia. And without US antagonization of Russia driving the two of them together, Russia likely doesn't end up aligning itself with China, as China sets up its own faction throughout East Asia as the continent finds itself split in three. The Russian faction in the north finds itself butting heads with Persia over the Caucasus and with China over Mongolia, and all three end up competing for dominance over Central Asia. As a result, Central Asia finds itself becoming the center of a ton of wars, conflicts, revolutions, and all sorts of stuff as the three major Asian powers compete for control. Even outside of Asia, the three powers also likely find themselves competing for control over Africa and trying to win the support of Europe. Speaking of Europe, without US involvement, the Europeans would likely pursue their own foreign policy ambitions, most likely putting them at odds with Russia, who had been expanding their influence back into their former territories. So, Europe would likely find itself becoming closer with Persia, a more strategic ally than China, as they both work to combat Russia. And so, as Russia finds itself surrounded by hostile powers on all sides, this likely leads to further aggression from Russia, as they potentially push to re-annex some of their former lands in Europe and invade parts of the Caucasus and Central Asia in order to prevent encroachment. With Russia once again invading its neighbors in search of regaining its power and influence, the world finds itself on the brink of another great conflict. And Persia, after rebuilding its former empire, finds itself growing in its position as a world power just as it was millennia ago. So, thanks for watching today's video. If you enjoyed, make sure to stick around for more. And hey, you could also maybe subscribe or something. So, that's it for today's video. Well, till next time, see ya.